Thanks for listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. Do remember you can subscribe to Farmers Weekly magazine and get all the latest news, views and market prices by visiting fwi.co.uk.
The underlying problem in this sector is that farmers do not make enough money for the hard work and commitment that they put in. I will consider my time as Secretary of State a failure if I do not improve profitability for farmers up and down this country.
Defra Secretary Steve Reid there, unveiling what the government says is a raft of new policies to boost profits for farmers. But how many of those policies are actually new? A Pancake Day Rally in London, will the government flip on inheritance tax? And how farming families can succeed at succession planning?
The Farmers Weekly podcast.
Welcome to the Farmers Weekly podcast. I'm Johann.
I'm Hugh Broom.
And I'm Louise Impey.
This episode recorded live at the NFU conference in London, where hundreds of farmers are gathering for their annual get-together. The big issues facing agriculture, that means inheritance tax, food security, a whole load of stuff on trade and the agri-environment too. All issues touched on in a keynote speech by Defra Secretary Steve Reid, and more on that later. But first, the mainstream media are out in force, broadcasting here from the QE2 conference centre, where the lawn outside is covered in hundreds of toy tractors, placed there on the grass by farming families who say the government's inheritance tax plans are going to hit the next generation of food producers very hard indeed. And an equally hard-hitting message from NFU President Tom Bradshaw, who told conference delegates the so-called family farm tax must be overturned.
Let me be clear. This policy is morally wrong and economically flawed. It's wrong because we were all promised it wouldn't happen. And conference, when you make a promise to farmers, you keep it. So conference, let us send a message clearly from this room today, alongside our fellow farming unions across Britain. We will not stop. We will not give in. We will fight this family farm tax until ministers do the right thing. To deliver on the government's commitment that food security is national security, we must have a legally mandated food security target. And yes, conference, it's time for the government to legislate, at long last, for a legally binding commitment for at least 50% of public sector food to be British. Conference, the time has come. It's long overdue. We call on this government to once and for all stop the import of food which would be illegal for you, our farmers, to produce here. Agriculture and the farmed environment is being shortchanged by our planning system. I'm sick and tired of seeing investment turned down that could grow a business and reduce its environmental impact. We see applications turned down for slurry stores, for climate-friendly buildings, and for critical infrastructure. So today, we are calling for food impact assessments to be carried out on all planning applications. Of course, there's more that we can and want to do to improve the farmed environment. I do recognise the efforts of the Secretary of State in securing the budget, when many predicted it would be cut. But when I hear claims of the largest ever budget being committed to sustainable farming, I need to challenge this. This government's half-term report makes pretty grim reading. Must do better. Doesn't even cover it. Let's start with must do, as they promised. Or perhaps, in the finest traditions of teaching, My comments on the Chancellor's report card should say, "See me."
That's NFU President Tom Bradshaw. Hugh, Louise, Tom Bradshaw taking to the conference stage in rolled-up shirt sleeves, speaking without a podium, nothing separating him from his NFU members in the audience. Very much, I felt, sending a message that, yes, he is NFU President, but he's also a farmer at heart and very much standing with his fellow farmers on this inheritance tax issue.
Yes, we had free-range Tom today, didn't we? I thought that his speech was really good. I thought he performed very well. We all know what the issues are and a lot of the things that he's had to contend with in the last year. He's certainly putting an awful lot of time and energy into this and the problems that we're facing at the moment. He had specific calls for the government. I think Steve Reid listened to all of his speech and we had the questions later, but he did get all his main points across. A really good presentation from him.
Inheritance tax very much front and centre of what he was talking about. No surprises there, but this family farm tax, this inheritance tax situation is going to really impact on the next generation of farmers.
Yes, and that was something that really came across in Tom's speech. He said that he had real concerns about the next generation, about the elderly, and also about tenant farmers. So he recognised the blood, sweat and tears that's gone into these businesses and what they are now contending with.
And a shopping list of other demands of government as well, Hugh.
Yeah, there was. There were several things, as you'd expect, more certainty when it comes to funding and grants, etc. One thing that Tom spelled out was this idea of having food assessments on planning, so highlighting the importance of food security, particularly with the geopolitical situation as it is globally at the moment, and on things like planning, saying, well, you should have a food assessment if you apply to put up a shed, as well as the environmental or the landscape impact. There should also be, if it's a bit of a tight decision, how much food will it deliver as a project? So yeah, there was lots of stuff, and I think it's really important that these blueprints, as the NFU have encapsulated them, that these are put out there, because yes, the inheritance tax thing, and as Joe Stanley during the ministerial questions put it so eloquently when he said, the IHT debate is sucking the life out of the room. It's sucking the oxygen out of the room, were his words. But it's really important that at the same time to keep pushing all of these other issues with all the other stuff that's going on, whether it's land use framework, fairness on trade. One of the things that Tom highlighted in his speech as well was getting this fairness on trade deals. We keep hearing the minister saying endlessly about how the Tory trade deals, like the Australia one, are bad for business and they are potentially damaging should the floodgates ever open from Australia. But the NFU President Tom Bradshaw highlighting things like, we have a fertiliser tax here now. How is it fair that someone on the other side of the world that doesn't have a fertiliser tax can land wheat on our shores unchallenged, untaxed, untariffed? It's not fair. So these are really important issues that we have to keep highlighting, as if we didn't have enough to do, other than the main thing which centres around the inheritance tax.
A call on imports, Louise, that imports shouldn't be allowed into the country once and for all if they're produced using methods that would be illegal here.
Yeah, and we've heard this before, haven't we? And it's very good to hear it repeated again today. We are really up against it. I mean, on a recent podcast episode, we talked about the domestic demand here for oilseed rape. Well, obviously, 2 million tonnes. We're not producing anything like that now. That's coming in from elsewhere. I'm not sure that the crushers know how that's being grown or how that's being produced, but that is a market that we should be able to supply. So that's really important.
That oilseed rape, imported oilseed rape, likely produced using neonicotinoid seed treatments that are banned here and have been for some time. Tom also took issue with the government's claim that its budget for agriculture is the biggest ever.
Biggest ever. It's like selling the hits, isn't it? Yeah, no, the government keeps saying it's the biggest ever. It's not. We know that. And let's reiterate it. We've reiterated it on the podcast a billion times. The numbers that they're talking about, spool back to 2016 when the CAP budget that came over from Brussels was, 2.4 billion. And then that was put out in single farm payment and agri-environment. So the money is the same. It's that I think they're calling it, they call it 5.2. So it's not even 2.4. 5.2 3.2 over 2 years. But then take into account the inflationary effect, and it's about 40 or 50% less than what was on offer in 2016. So quite rightly, the President highlighting what was going on there. And the other thing is this cash flow crisis, which is huge. I mean, this whole transition thing, whether it's cutting off your left leg of your BPS unexpectedly earlier this year or the end of last year, which has caused, some massive issues with many farm businesses, the whole uncertainty of the grants thing, there's never been a time where the whole cash flow crisis thing has been more pertinent. And indeed, producers, again, aside the inheritance tax thing, producers sitting there thinking, well, how the hell is this government helping me? Because at the moment, all I can see is just closed doors everywhere I look.
And in a week when children have gone back to school after half-term, Louise, Tom had a half-term report card for the government.
He did, didn't he? And he basically said, must do better doesn't cover it. He wants to see them keep the promises that they made, not break them. And then he had a final report card for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, in which he said, see me.
See me, indeed, a reference to the fact that the Chancellor is still not engaging with the industry on inheritance tax, Hugh.
No, and in the press session after the main political event, in the press room, Tom Bradshaw was asked by our very own Andrew Meredith, actually, Farmers Weekly editor, if he thought the Chancellor was a coward for not meeting him. And Tom was quite blatant, and he said she was, because if she is prepared to keep pushing this tax agenda and pushing this policy, yet at no point has she actually met anyone about it. It sounds like we don't know whether she's met Steve Reid or not, but she certainly won't meet any of her own backbench Labour MPs. Those Labour MPs who are brave enough to call this out for the wrong policy that it is. She refuses to meet them. She refuses to meet the NFU. She refuses to meet anyone external to talk about this. And Tom said, quite frankly, if you're so right about this, then at least have the decency to meet me on the stump, look me in the eye, and then tell me if you think you're so right that I should get back in my box and get out of here.
Tough talk then from farm leader Tom Bradshaw here at NFU conference. We're going to catch up with Tom a little bit later in this episode, but first, a short break.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Now's the perfect time to upgrade your tractor to a Kubota M Series and take advantage of 0% financing and a 5-year Kubota Care manufacturer warranty, included across Kubota's range of 66 to 175 horsepower tractors until the 31st of March 2025. Kubota's M Series tractors are designed for efficiency and comfort, featuring smart farming features that save you both time and money, making them a powerful and affordable choice for your farm. Plus, order our new flagship M7004 series by the 31st of March and receive a free comfort upgrade package worth more than £1,750. Don't miss out. Terms and conditions apply. Contact your dealer or visit www.kubota.co.uk for more details.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly Podcast, recorded live here in London at the NFU's 2025 conference. From a Chancellor of the Exchequer who refuses to engage with the industry to a Cabinet Minister who will. Defra Secretary Steve Reid.
My focus is on ensuring farming becomes more profitable, because that is the best way to make your businesses viable for the future. And that's how we ensure the long-term food security this country needs. Tom has repeatedly told me farmers need certainty about seasonal workers. I've listened, Tom, and I'm pleased to announce that we are extending the seasonal worker visas for 5 years. For the first time ever, we are measuring where the public sector buys food from, so we can use the government's own purchasing power to back British produce wherever we can. I've worked with my colleague Pat McFadden in the Cabinet Office to create new requirements for government catering contracts to favour high-quality, high-welfare products that British producers are well placed to meet. This means British farmers and producers can compete for a fairer share of the £5 billion a year the public sector spends on food. That's money straight into farmers' bank accounts to boost turnover and boost profits. We will never lower our food standards in trade agreements, and will always consider whether overseas produce has an unfair advantage. We are investing in the UK agri-technology sector with a further £110 million in farming grants being announced today. Farms must be resilient to future challenges if they are to remain financially viable and strengthen food security. That includes severe flooding and droughts through to animal disease, like the blue tongue virus, avian flu, or the recent case of foot and mouth that we saw in Germany. That's why we're investing £208 million to set up a new National Biosecurity Centre, modernising the Animal and Plant Health Agency facilities at Weybridge to protect farmers, food producers and exporters from disease outbreaks that can wipe out businesses in a moment. I recognise the frustration when we had to pause the capital grants offer last year without proper warning because of unprecedented levels of demand. I promised to update you as soon as I could, and I can confirm today that every application submitted for capital grants before the pause in November will be taken forward, and following this, we will reopen the Elm capital grants offer this summer.
Defra Secretary Steve Reed. Hugh, the man who, wherever he goes in farming circles, seems to be accompanied by the sound of tractor air horns playing Baby Shark.
Yeah, we had the tractor air horns today whilst the Minister was here. The Minister stood up. The speech that he gave was very similar to the one that he gave at Oxford, and his themes that he trots out, I suppose. I think they possibly think, well, how can we offset this inheritance tax issue, the elephant in the room, if you will? So it's all about profitability. And there was lots of mention, the establishment of a farm profitability unit in Defra, which, hey, look, let's welcome that. That's fine. And I think there was a lot that was in the Minister's speech that, again, had the IHT issue not been there, there's a heck of a lot that would have been welcome. I mean, listening to that speech and comparing it to previous Minister's speeches in recent years, I would say it was pretty farmed up. He talks about food, he talks about farmers producing food. The criticism of government, say 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, or even a couple of years ago, was the Minister stands up and doesn't acknowledge that farmers produce food. Well, now they're acknowledging that you're producing all this food and they want to tax the heck out of you. And the one thing that slightly grates, though, is this whole idea of profit. And he keeps talking about, I want to make this industry profitable. I'll have failed in my duty if it's not profitable. And you sort of think, are they that naive that they think they can make it profitable so we can all pay gazillions every year for 10 years in inheritance tax? Your small average family farm being faced with finding, say, 50 to 100 grand a year to pay the tax bill over 10 years. Where the hell's the profit going to come from? The margins have got to be off the scale to pay that and make profit to use on other things as well. So slightly naive in terms of that approach.
It was very much a paradox. This idea that this admission by Steve Reed that farming isn't profitable, hence setting up this farm profitability unit at Defra, and yet at the same time saying we are going to press ahead with this 20% inheritance tax on farm assets worth more than £1 million. Well, the only way that farmers are going to be able to pay that tax, settle that tax bill, is by selling an asset, because by Steve Reed's own admission, Louise, farming just isn't profitable. Profitability was a big thing for you in his speech.
I think he said the word profit more than he said any other word at all. There was the odd mention, of course, of transition, which we've heard from him before. He did actually say, judge me as a failure if I don't improve profitability while I'm in office. So that's on record. He said that to all of us. I thought there was some good news, some chinks of light with the capital grant situation, and he did announce today that every application that had been submitted before they paused capital grants back in November, every single one of those applications will be honoured. So that's good news, isn't it? We've been waiting for that, and people are very frustrated about some of that. He also announced, didn't he, some new investments, some more money for the sector, but we're not actually sure that any of that is actually new funding, and in fact some of that has been reduced from when it was first launched. So good and bad, really.
It's the wondrous world, and to be fair, the last government was just as guilty of the constant recycling of the mythical 110 million, which just seems to be the figure du jour, which they like to slot into press releases at events like this. No one's got a Scooby, whether that was new, old, or whatever money. Positives also, to be fair to the minister that came out of his speech, he talked about a campaign on biosecurity. Obviously, they re-delivered the 203 million quid refit of Weybridge and the APHA labs, which they keep trotting that one out. They've been trotting that one out for about 18 months now. Well, I think the last lot started to trot it out before this lot took over. But he did actually acknowledge the amount of illegal meat. He said 290 tonnes of illegal meat have been seized by Border Force and other port authorities in the last year. And he alluded that he was talking to the Home Office, looking at whether, for example, there should be crushing vans of the people caught bringing this over the border, which is a huge biosecurity threat. We know, particularly what's been happening in Germany with that foot and mouth the other week, that he was basically looking at policy to effectively crush and destroy these vans on entry should be there. So there's a positive there. He alluded as well, Tom obviously talked about planning in this review of national planning policy frameworks that's going to happen this summer. He alluded to that as well. So there were a few positives in there, as well as this, quite worth. You can't knock him for talking about profit, but it's whether you're talking it in the realistic context, and particularly in an industry which operates on finite margins. If you're going to suddenly, how are you going to increase these profit margins without ultimately expecting the output price, the cost of food, to go up massively if we're all to see these huge profits? Now, that would be great, but what impact's that going to have on inflation for the rest of the population?
Not only profit, Louise, also public procurement. This pledge that public sector bodies are going to source 50% or at least 50% of their food locally or to standards that are at least the same standards as those met by British farmers. Not going as far as saying it will be British, but certainly that British standards will be met.
Yeah, he said that our farmers will get a fairer share of this expenditure, and I'm not actually quite sure what the total expenditure is of public procurement of food, but he is saying they're going to back British produce, farmers will see more, it's going to boost turnover and profits, but what we haven't seen today is any detail around that, or how that might work, or whether budgets are going to be increased to take account of that.
Hugh, Louise and I watched this on the big screen from the press room. You were actually in the hall with NFU delegates.
Yeah, I was in the hall. The last time the NFU conference was in London was 2008, which was the centenary year of the NFU conference, and a very different feeling. Then it was quite warm and cosy. Gordon Brown was our keynote speaker. He did his first time. Well, he used to roll out every time he stood in front of farmers. He would talk about how his grandfather had a farm, and it was all very warm and cuddly, despite the challenges that were on the agenda back in 2008. Fast forward to 2025, and yeah, it was probably a pretty cold and frosty feeling in the room. Look, credit where credit's due. The minister, if he'd really wanted to, could have stood aside and not bothered to turn up or sent his junior. He stood up there. He resolutely stuck to his lines, whether he believes in it or not himself. He stuck there like a pro, and give the guy some credit. You may not agree with his policy, you may not agree with the things he says, but as an operator, as a communicator, he may infuriate you with his answers, but he did a pretty good job at sticking to it right the way through. I think there was one little bit where he asked Ali Kappa not to interrupt him. I didn't interrupt your question. Why are you interrupting me? And a few delegates got a bit fuming about that. But I think on the whole, it was a business-like atmosphere. Worth noting that during his session, and particularly at the beginning of his speech, when he was talking about we're not budging on the inheritance tax, yada yada. Several delegates got up and walked out. Not many, but quite a few did.
So Louise, that's Hugh with the view from the conference floor. How was it for you?
Yeah, I would pick up on one of the things that Hugh has just mentioned. Steve Reed had to face some quite strong questions about personal circumstances of people facing this inheritance tax issue. And every single time he said, I can't comment on individual circumstances. And that really wasn't very helpful because there were some strong questions on that. And I have to take my hat off to David Passmore, who did a very good job at asking him that question.
Well, that's the verdict then from the Farmers Weekly podcast on NFU Conference 2025. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be speaking to NFU President Tom Bradshaw himself and getting his verdict on NFU Conference here in London.
The Farmers Weekly podcast. The Farmers Weekly podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. Welcome along wherever you're listening to us from. You can email us, podcast@fwi.co.uk. And if you're in the UK itself, you can also message us by texting the word farm, followed by your message to 88440. Love to hear from you. Love to hear your views on inheritance tax, on the situation in farming, on the challenges faced by the industry. You've heard a few of them earlier on in this episode, including from NFU President Tom Bradshaw, who joins us now. Tom, Steve Reed's speech, the conference, as expected today?
I think so. A very frosty atmosphere in there, but that's nothing that's surprising. I mean, members are angry, and they wanted to demonstrate to the Secretary of State how strongly they feel about this, and they have my full support to do that.
No surprises, I guess, from Steve Reed when it comes to inheritance tax. Joe Stanley, though, saying that the issue's sucking oxygen out of the room. If we park inheritance tax and just put it to the side, just for one moment, it wasn't a bad speech by Steve Reed in terms of all of the other things that he said.
I know, isn't that what they hoped we'd be focusing on? The fact that they've unlocked the grant schemes and they've recognised the importance of the risks at our borders, and that they're going to try and put better deterrents in place so that they're to try and stop those illegal meat imports. Seasonal workers scheme for 5 years. I mean, that's something we've been asking for a long while. So there's elements here that are an uplift for HLS as well, which is another bit long-standing ask. So there's elements there that, in peacetime, would actually, I think, have got a pretty good round of applause. But the way the industry's feeling today, they can't plan for the future. And that's the problem.
And in terms of the future for inheritance tax in your campaign against the family farm tax, where does the NFU go from here?
But my big belief is still that there's only two really important audiences in this, and they are the public, and that public support needs to be broad. It can't just be from those people who didn't vote for this government. It's got to have a broad base of support, and we've also got to broaden the appeal to more MPs. So we've got to make it relevant to inner city, urban Labour MPs. Why should food matter to them? It should matter to 70 million people living on this island, that we have a thriving food system. And when I look at the geopolitical situation around the world, it feels like the world order's being turned upside down. And there's never been a more important time to invest in our domestic food production. Only 3 weeks ago, Tim Lang produced a report with the National Preparedness Commission highlighting we're already food insecure and that we need a food security target. These are all things that we will build our campaign around now to try and make it more relevant to a wider audience, and ultimately focus on that finance bill in the autumn and make government worried that there'll be enough backbench support for them not to get the tax change through.
The government will probably say that this 50% public procurement pledge that it's made is going to go some way to realising that it is backing farmers through that. Not the case, according to you, though.
Well, clearly it doesn't make up for the inheritance tax, because the problem with the inheritance tax is that if somebody dies in the wrong order, or as we know, those people in the eye of the storm, those elderly members of our community or those that are ill, then however much the wider profitability of the industry might improve, it doesn't help those individual people. And that's the problem, and that is you can put all the foundations in place, but you will not sort things out for those individual businesses. And that's where it's so wrong. The public procurement is a long-standing ask, but they've got to make it a viable option, supplying food into the public sector. And all too often, the budgets are too low to make it a viable option for our members to supply into that marketplace. And so how we sort that out and how we make it a profitable sector to supply is going to be a really interesting part of this. But also, if you listen carefully, he said that British farmers would be very well placed to produce to the standards required. He did not make a commitment it would be British produced food going into the public sector. So I think that is a significant difference. But it's one that hopefully the standards we produce to should be able to access into that marketplace.
Chancellor Rachel Reeves still refusing to meet you on this issue. There have been calls from some in the farming community for pressure to be ratcheted up for more militant action. You've come in under some criticism for not going down that route yourself as the NFU. What do you say to those farmers that really want to take protest one stage further?
But first of all, I fully understand their anger, and that's the position I've taken from the start. Is I know why farmers are upset. This is an incredibly challenging period for us to be working through, and so that is the starting place. I talked about how we win this. We win this with Labour MPs. Those Labour MPs have to have the ability to challenge their government, probably privately, but ultimately publicly. And if we don't make it acceptable for them to protest or for them to raise these issues, if we take it to such a political level that they're unable to raise it with their whips, with the Treasury, then we don't get the ultimate answer that we need. So I know that lobbying is boring, and I know it doesn't answer the sort of or quench the sort of frustration. But it is how we get through this. So we will continue to build our campaign around lobbying, which is what we've always done. But I also know that farmers are feeling really frustrated and really angry, and that they want to try and have their voices heard.
You seemed to suggest a couple of weeks ago, Tom, that the government might have made concessions on inheritance tax by now had farmers not forced the Prime Minister to cut short a visit to Milton Keynes. You suggested that if you were Keir Starmer, that protest wouldn't have put you in the mind to make a concession. In fact, you would have doubled down on it. Was there any indication that things might have been different?
We don't have that evidence at all, and I think that looking back 2 weeks now, we've got to look forwards. We can't continue to look backwards. We've got to look forwards at how we build the pressure in this campaign moving forwards. I want a united industry, but I also think at times, however difficult it is, I do have a responsibility to try and highlight things where I don't think it's right. Because if we don't highlight that action, the next action will be more extreme, and the next action will be more extreme. And I don't think that's right. To keep public support and build public support in those areas that we don't have that support at the moment, and to give those Labour MPs a voice.
A marathon, not a sprint, as we've said on the podcast before.
And that's exactly what we said to NFU Council back at the beginning of December, that we've moved from sprint mode into marathon mode. And the marathon doesn't end until the finance bill in the autumn. And we can't think that there's going to be one action that suddenly sorts this out. This is going to be a prolonged building of pressure that eventually gets the government to a point where they believe the backbenchers are willing to challenge them on this. And that is how we build this campaign.
NFU President Tom Bradshaw, thank you very much. Now, I have had an email about that Milton Keynes protest a fortnight or so ago from Charles Scaling, a young dairy, beef and arable farmer from Pickering in Yorkshire. And Charles says, I was very disappointed to hear your total condemnation of the farmers disrupting Prime Minister's visit to Milton Keynes. The whole industry needs to stand together and work together. And ultimately, says Charles, that protest got just as much media coverage as earlier protests in London, and it was achieved by only a few tractors compared to hundreds. Charles says that he very much understands the point that direct action that is too militant will hurt the cause, but he says he hardly thinks that beeping horns in the background of a visit can be classed as too militant. Ultimately, he says, we need to keep the pressure on and use that pressure, and it can't be ignored by the Prime Minister. Otherwise, we risk being forgotten about as an industry. Louise, what's your take on Charles's letter?
Well, I think Charles Scaling made some really good points in that email, actually. He pointed out that Keir Starmer's in a very precarious position at the moment. Not that many people are supporting Labour. He says there's no problem with annoying the Prime Minister. He says that farmers still have the public on their side, and I agree with him on that, actually. He makes the point that beeping a few horns, it's not really that bad. So that wasn't a big problem. And actually, he also makes the point that they got lots of media coverage from that very small protest. So, he makes some good points. He does say in that email that the Farmers Weekly podcast team condemned that protest. I don't think we did do that, Charles. Sorry to say that. I think we considered it and we discussed it. We didn't really come down on the side of condemning it. I would just come back to you on that one. But otherwise, some very good points. And Charles, you will be pleased to know that an article has been done on the implications of the carbon tax, and that is up online on the Farmers Weekly website this week.
Louise, I did actually say that I felt that whilst lawful protest anywhere, anytime is fantastic and great, I queried about upsetting people's schedules, and you could see why he'd get wound up if you upset his schedule. And I apologise for that, but that was just a view at the time with regards to Charles's email.
Now, one of the next protests that's coming up is going to be on March the 4th, again in London, not with tractors, but a Pancake Day protest, March 4th on the 4th of March. This protest being organised by the same group of farmers that organised the very first big protest in Whitehall. We've got one of them on the line now, Herefordshire farmer Martin Williams. Martin, how did this idea come about?
Well, when we initially did the first one, we always felt, as Hugh has explained, that it was going to be a longer term game than perhaps we thought initially. And as the dialogue has gone along, we felt that before the spring statement, it was perhaps necessary to highlight the farmers' plight yet again. And here we are on March the 4th, and Pancake Day just seemed to be a very appropriate time to do it. It's the start of Lent, so the start of that period of going without food, and the time to show what eggs and flour and sugar and all those things that we produce are made from.
So, Martin, clearly you as a group already know that there's quite a bit of support for another protest.
We would hope so. With this event, we're trying to make it different to others that have gone before it. You need to make it different. And so to make it different, this will be a march. This will be also an educational piece. It's several messages that we're going to bring out in this piece. One of it is the fact that people are trapped by policy, and the older generation who may have found themselves paying death duties on their own fathers are now finding themselves in the position where they're well, almost embarrassingly to say it, they're better off not here on April the 26th. And so we'd like to highlight that. We'd also like to highlight the costs involved with agriculture in producing a pancake. And we'd also like to give people the opportunity to march, something that they haven't had before. We'd love to see as many people as possible. We'd love to see as many older people as possible, because we'd like to highlight that, and we'd like to ask for this amnesty for those people to be able to transfer land, which in fact sits outside of the policy. We could leave the policy as it is if you wish, but just let these people off the hook, and it would give perhaps breathing space for the industry to restructure over the next 4 years.
And Martin, it is on Pancake Day. It is a Pancake Day protest. You're asking people to leave their tractors at home, come on foot. Can we expect to see, I don't know, farmers banging frying pans or bringing pancakes with them?
Well, they're welcome to bring a pancake with them. We don't want any eggs thrown on the day. That would be unfortunate. But we are going to provide pancakes on the day to MPs. We'd love them to come out and have a pancake with us and to interact with the crowd to show the plight. It's very difficult, and we've been talking previously on this podcast, or you have, about engagement with backbench MPs. We were told back in November after the initial rally that the Labour Party were quite happy to throw them to the wolves because they weren't expecting to get some of those seats in the first place. And so it would be lovely if we could get some of those inner city MPs and some of those front bench MPs onto Parliament Square and into Whitehall, and to share a pancake with us and to understand the concerns that we've got.
So, Martin, we want to get lots of people. I shall come up on the train on March 4th. What do I have to do to take part? Do I have to register, or do I just turn up? Where do I go? Where do I get the train to?
In a perfect world, you'd register. There is a link that will be shared in the Farming Press this week. It is also on the Farming Forum. There's a landing page on there. As the week progresses, you'll find registration details for you to just pop your name in there. It's not very onerous. It's very, very simple just to get a gauge on numbers. The police have been absolutely fantastic over this, as they were the last time, and we're hoping to be as open and honest as we can.
That's protest organiser and Herefordshire farmer Martin Williams. And to help Martin get a gauge on numbers, we'll put a link so you can register for that Pancake Day Rally on the show notes page of this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. For now, though, let's get a gauge on other numbers. Hugh, the markets.
Thank you very much, Johann. The finished clear deadweight this week edges up another penny, 636.9, up from 635.2. Onto the sheep at 736.9. Pretty much stands on exactly to last week. That was 736.9. Pigs SPP this week, that has gone up actually, 203.91, up from 202.82. And to the arable markets, feed week this week, almost the same. It's gone back by 20p, so it's 176.40 the spot this week versus last week was 176.60. Billing week 202 dead, that's gone up by 20p. Feed barley, don't feel too rich. Feed barley 158.80, that stands on exactly. Oilseed rape edges up marginally, £430.40, up from £428.90. Feed peas, they've gone up 219.7, and feed beans go up as well, about £8 actually. Big rise there. How exciting! £220 10p, up from £212 10p last week. And if you are buying diesel this week, you should be paying around 70.77 pence. For a litre of red tractor diesel. That has dropped back exactly a penny on the week.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
And finally, the challenges around inheritance tax have shone the spotlight on the importance of succession planning and handing on the farm successfully to the next generation. It's seldom an easy thing for any family to do, but to make it easier, a group of succession experts has come together to form the Succession Alliance. Rural business consultant Michael Mack.
So the Succession Alliance was set up off the concept that there was lots of us working independently on succession planning with a focus on sort of the human side of the family, yet we're all working in isolation, and I was sitting there thinking, well, I need to work with other people, I need to bring some ideas together. So I reached out to a number of people who I knew were working in the same field and also researchers and so forth, and got an amazing response. Everyone said, this is what we need. We need to get behind actually a collective voice to deal with the issues of succession planning. So that was sort of the brainchild in December, and here we are.
And inheritance tax has highlighted the importance of succession planning, but succession itself, it's not about the tax aspect, is it? That's for the accountants.
Yeah, but succession in itself incorporates all those parts of the business, the assets, the family. It's way bigger than that question of tax. So whilst the inheritance tax has raised the issue in many people's minds, now is the time also to start thinking about why have we got a farm, and what are we trying to achieve with it, and what do we want to do to help our family succeed and grow into the future.
Have you had a lot more inquiries since the autumn budget?
I think that's one of our biggest challenges as a group. We're all flat out with lots of inquiries, lots of workshops, lots of people wanting help, working with more and more families. So finding the time to lead on this initiative, it has been a challenge for us all, but it's one that we all embrace because there are more and more people out there who are looking at these challenges. It's interesting, pre-budget, the inquiries we were getting were more from families and the next generation trying to get involved. Now the inquiries are more from the older generation looking for more, they're looking for some solutions, and therefore that whole dynamic's changed a little bit.
And you've got some good experts on board, so you can cover the whole country. You've got Matt Lobley from Exeter University down in the southwest, Heather Wildman in Scotland, also Andy Guy, who joins us now. Andy, what area do you cover, and what's happening in your neck of the woods?
Hi, Johann. I'm based in the Midlands near Nottingham, and travel quite widely actually. So I'm part of a team of 9 of us that have come together to set up the Alliance, which gives us a sort of national coverage. It's a really big step forward, I think, for what we're trying to do.
And the farmers in your area, what are the challenges that they face in terms of succession when you speak to them?
I don't think it's unique to my neck of the woods, to be honest. I think it's the same across the country, and it's the challenges of holding these conversations with the rest of the generations in your family. It doesn't matter whether you're the older generation or the youngest in the family. It's how to broach those conversations, and particularly now after the budget. What was previously an awkward conversation has become an urgent one, and so families, I think, are a little bit like rabbits in the headlights of the car. They're not quite sure which way to turn, I think, at the moment.
It is such a difficult subject to broach, Andy. How should people get started?
Yeah, I mean, it really is, and some families are very lucky; they're very open and can talk about all sorts of things. But most families, and I think especially farming families, find this a really difficult conversation to have. So it's been on that back burner because it's awkward and difficult to broach. But how do you get started? Well, somebody has to start the conversation, and for some families, that just needs a little bit of some help from outside, a bit of independent facilitation to help the conversation go more smoothly, and to make sure that everybody gets a fair share of the conversation and gets to say their piece, so that there's no misunderstandings or comebacks later on. It's a really important conversation to have with the whole family.
And Mike, for farmers and other people who want to get in touch with the Succession Alliance, how do they do that?
Firstly, if they go onto the successionalliance.com website, there's a newsletter, so they can subscribe, and we will keep them up to date on what's going on with our work and the whole journey of succession planning. And they can drop us an email, they can give us a call, and we will do what we can to help. There's also a list of all the partners on there, so if they want to get a professional to come out to the farm to help them, then there's lots of people local. Probably there should be one local to them because we cover the whole of the country.
That's Michael Mack and Andy Guy from the Succession Alliance, and that website address again, successionalliance.com. We'll put a link to that website on the show notes page of this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. Louise, making a success of Succession, not a bad idea at all.
Well, absolutely. And this is a service that obviously is very much needed at the moment, unfortunately. So we know, don't we, from previous items we've done about succession, these are difficult conversations. They're ones that some farming families, not all, some farming families find very difficult to have. But of course, at the moment, they're incredibly important. So if there is an easier way or for people to set up meetings and have these conversations, then I think that can only be a good thing, really. When you get hit with something like the industry has been hit with, out of the blue, no warning, it does create anxiety, it does create stress. So if there's an obvious route for the people who are really feeling under pressure at the moment, then I think that has to be a good thing. There is a need for this service, and they do need to sit down and start somewhere.
We will put a link to the Succession Alliance, successionalliance.com, on the show notes page of this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. I guess it's good because you don't actually have to pick up the phone and speak to anybody. Sometimes it is easier just to send an email, and you can do that. And as both Mike and Andy were saying, a confidential service as well, Hugh.
Yeah, it is. And I just echo what Louise said. It is really important because not everyone can look. I suppose someone gobby like me sits the family down and says, right, what are we going to do? Boom. Which we did about 10 years ago, or no, longer. But yes, not everyone does that, and it's really hard, particularly if you've got a particularly in charge patriarch or matriarch, as it were, who's firmly hanging on to the reins, refusing to let go, and expecting you to still carry on doing what you're doing at 62 on enough money a week to buy a couple of pints and a packet of peanuts. And so it is hard conversations to be had, and at least there's somewhere they can go or can at least have a quiet word on the sidelines without compromising anything or upsetting anyone. And I think the key thing with this, whichever level you come into this succession debate, whether you're old, young, very young, or whatever, It's being, like with anything where you're trying to plan a strategy or something going forward, it's being armed with the facts of where it sits and the what if scenarios. And it is tricky saying, well, when you die, this could happen. You know, you're saying that to someone that's nurtured you and raised you. It's really hard work. But actually, you need to gameplay it, and you actually need to put your special business hat on and gameplay it in the cold light of day and go through it. And if this service helps people to do that, to cross that bridge, because this is the first stage, when they then start to presumably lay stuff down in a more formal fashion, then they'll need to involve the solicitors and the accountants and get it all squared away. But it's a conversation that we've been saying forever on the podcast needs to happen. And if this, before all the stuff happened that's happened in the last 6 months or 4 months, but if this helps it to happen and it's an easy way of doing it for people, then absolutely to be applauded, and let's hope it's really successful.
Some good hints and tips and advice then from the Succession Alliance on successful succession. Do have a look at that website. As I say, there's a link on the show notes page, and that just about wraps up this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast from the NFU's 2025 conference here in London. But before we go, Hugh, Louise, your final thoughts.
There's still plenty of mainstream media interest in farming and what's happening in our industry at the moment, and we're out here looking as they're still broadcasting out there. People are climbing on those tractors, so we are headlines at the moment, and we need to keep it that way.
Keep that public support, Hugh.
Yeah, absolutely. Watching the NFU office holders being photographed, interviewed and whatnot all around the toy tractors and the large tractors, it means that, it's still on the public agenda. It's back to what we've always said, it's a marathon. We've just got to keep highlighting this IHT issue and keep influencing whoever we can, local MPs, whoever it is, just to keep tapping away, because this is not going to go away. And certainly, as Tom said in his speech today, the farmers aren't going to go away. They're going to keep going.
Until next week, then, please do subscribe to the Farmers Weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like what you hear, do leave us a 5-star review. Do also email us, podcast@fwi.co.uk. And if you're in the UK itself, you can message us by texting the word farm, followed by your message to 88440. Until next week, though, I'm Johann.
I'm Hugh Broom.
And I'm Louise Impey.
Thank you for listening.